Okay. Okay. Hello to all of you, and welcome to this session of Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG, on the SPS MS-12 declaration and the ways to enhance regular body of the WTO. This is, of course, a subject you all know that we FMG has done a lot of discussions, and Bernard and other members have written extensively on this as one of the kind of pillar of potential WTO reform to enhance the regular body of the WTO various committee and council meetings. Of course, we were very excited about the recent MSTL declaration on this responding to modern SPS challenges, number 27, which asked the SPS committee to explore new ways on how to enhance the implementation of SPS agreement, and specifically the declaration also asked the committee to undertake a work program open to all members, and then try to identify the challenges in implementing the agreement, and also the impact of emerging challenges on the application of the agreement. So we think that gives us a new opportunity to look at how this declaration and also the potential follow-up work would give us new ideas on how to further the function of the regular body and council meetings of the WTO. So with that, I will give floor to Bernard, who is probably our best expert on this, and also with good speakers. Bernard, floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, the experts are the speakers, not me. So I'm here to keep time. I think the only thing I would add in terms of kind of providing a little bit of context is obviously the focus today is on phytosanitary measures, the committee, where we go. That's, of course, pretty specific. But I would kind of raise the point that a lot of what has been happening, certainly in SPS, also in the TBT committees, revolves around kind of innovative approaches towards actually enhancing transparency and fostering deliberation. Now, that's, of course, one of the things that's on the WTO reform agenda. And in particular, this mechanism of specific trade concerns and bringing in experts to actually talk substance, which is a feature of the SPS TBT committees, I think is something that also could and already is to some extent being used in other committees. So I think we should keep that in mind, and maybe come back to that during the discussion in terms of what do we learn from the SPS experience that is transferable to the rest of the WTO. Anyway, I don't want to prejudge the discussion. So we have two excellent speakers, as you all know. We're going to start with Christian Wolf, who was at the Secretariat and works on this subject. And then we'll have an intervention by Bob Wolf, who has written a lot on SPS, on standards more generally, and the WTO. So both last names are Wolf. I also see an Alan Wolf on the screen here, so we have a dominant of wolves. Anyway, Christian, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me to be here among the other wolves and other participants. I thought I would briefly say a couple of words about the SPS declaration in case not everybody is super familiar with it. A few words about the SPS committee and how it works. And then third, share some ideas on why some of this might be relevant in the context of discussions on WTO reform. But there I'm hoping that Bob will have a lot more ideas. Starting with the SPS declaration, it basically, for those who may not be as familiar with it, does three things. It reaffirms the relevance of the SPS agreement and the rights and obligations. Then it recognizes the importance of the SPS committee in advancing the implementation of the SPS agreement, But it also recognizes that the agricultural landscape has changed dramatically in basically the past generation since the adoption of the SPS agreement. And it notes that there are a number of new challenges and opportunities in the sector, from climate change, environmental challenges, demographic changes, to new health risks, the growing importance of sustainable food systems, but also the existence of new technologies and tools. And then just also notes the persistent obstacles to trade that just continue to exist. And then finally, it instructs the SPS committee to carry out a work program and to report back to MC13 with possible recommendations. So reaffirming the SPS agreement, recognizing the importance of the committee, but also that things have shifted, have changed in the meantime, and then the instructing the committee to do something. And the work program is interesting in that, first, the challenges that are noted are quite broad, climate change, demographic changes, and so on. But then the work program is actually quite specific. It sort of provides a rather specific, narrow scope for 5 bullet points in the declaration for what the committee is to discuss, and also anchoring it very closely to the text of the SPS agreement. So providing quite clear instructions. Okay, don't go crazy discussing all these challenges, but really focus it on your mandate, on the SPS committee's area of work. Now, a couple of things on the SPS committee. I mean, the SPS committee normally has 3 large areas of work. It does a lot of information sharing and also experience sharing. And this, for example, through agenda items where members just report on new developments, maybe big, important institutional changes, legislative changes, or events. Japan is still reporting, for example, on the follow-up to the Fukushima power plant incident and the implications that has for the safety of its food, or if there are important events that have taken place, a conference, something that the outcomes of which could be of interest to everyone. But also experience sharing in a more focused way in the context of thematic sessions or workshops where members propose topics and then take a deep dive and share experiences, invite outside speakers to really enlighten the committee on a particular topic. The second large area of work is specific trade concerns, and quite a bit has been said of those. The committee spends a large part of its agenda discussing individual trade barriers or individual measures taken by members that have an effect on trade, and basically exchanging statements on those. And about half of those are eventually reported as resolved. And then the third large area of work is in clarifying rules, preparation of guidance documents. The SPS committee has adopted a number of decisions, procedures, guidelines on the implementation of particular articles or providing helpful guidance, for example, on how to deal with SPS issues and so on. So what some would consider to be soft law. Now, there are a lot of interlinkages between these areas of work. Of course, information that is shared is usually shared not just because it's nice to share it, but with something in mind, avoiding trade friction, preventing obstacles, or convincing others of the transparency and of the efficacy of one's own SPS system. And interventions on specific trade concerns are not just complaints about specific measures, but they often go into great detail and take great care to explain the regulatory approaches that are being taken, and either why the other members' regulatory approach is not in line with what the SPS agreement foresees, or how it's different from the own members' regulatory approach. So quite a lot of discussion of of commenting basically on each other's measures and on each other's approaches, and why one might be more in line with the agreement than the other. And then different forms of exchanges about what constitutes good practice, basically. I think in the discussions of specific trade concerns, in the deep dives on particular topics, and in the context of thematic sessions, in a lot of discussion of how to implement the SPS agreement, what is acceptable, which often about shared policy objectives in terms of ensuring, say, food, sustainable food production, and so on, and discussing the best ways to go about that. Now, lately, the adoption of decisions has been more difficult. There have been, I would say, fewer decisions adopted in the last few years. But what is interesting is that that does not always seem to be the aim of the proposals that members put forward. This is something that I've come to realize this thought has occurred to me over the past few years, where initially I was expecting when members proposed thematic sessions, there to be at the end, okay, and these were the main points, and we're going to use this to provide some sort of guidance to develop some sort of committee decision. But it seems that for members, having the exchanges and sharing the experiences, explaining the approaches, and hearing from outside experts on topics of interest doesn't have to lead to developing guidance necessarily. So in a way, just having the exchange seems to be a value in and of itself. We've been trying to support that by scheduling side events, inviting other organizations to provide updates on relevant research, and so on, which has meant that the SPS committee weeks have become very, very full. But this seems to be appreciated as it has become sort of a hub for sharing information. Now, 3 ideas. How is this relevant for discussions on WTO reform? And really happy to engage with others on their ideas. But in discussing the practical aspects of the work program of the SPS declaration, what has struck me is that what members have said again and again is that they really would like this to be an opportunity for open dialogue. So not dialogue in the sense that we all come to the meeting with our speaking points and we read them to each other, but dialogue in the sense of actually listening to and reacting to each other's points. So they've said they want this to be very much member-led and small groups, very open and transparent, and then reporting back to the committee on any relevant points that may come out of these small group discussions. So it seems to me that what this is pointing at is that committee discussions are appreciated as a form of regulatory cooperation that even if maybe the approaches are not necessarily getting closer, or it doesn't seem, at least from my perspective, for example, in the endless discussions we have on the European versus the American approaches on regulations on pesticides, but just having the conversation is a value in and of itself and exchanging the information. So I think we're in a way moving beyond the purely outcome-oriented focus of committee work, which was more, okay, so what's the decision going to be? What's the guidance going to be? And really focusing on the opportunities for engagement and for exchange. This was very evident in the last review. The SPS committee conducts reviews of the operation and implementation of the SPS agreement every 4 years. And in the last one, that was already very evident, where a lot of the proposals from members were to have a thematic session, have a discussion on something, share experience on something without it necessarily leading to a recommendation to do something. So in a way, the journey has become the destination and the discussions themselves seem to have a value, whether or not they lead to recommendations. And I think thinking about what we in the Secretariat can do to facilitate that, I think realizing that the fact that SPS committee meetings have become these hubs where everybody comes together to focus on this particular topic, promoting these opportunities for knowledge sharing, promoting the space also for bilateral meetings, for cooperation and exchanges on regulatory approaches. But I think also creating environments where dialogue is possible and where the stakes maybe are a little bit lower. so that people are not scared to deviate from the speaking notes that they have been sent from Capital, but they can actually listen to each other and react to each other in a much more free way. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot for that. Very, very interesting. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the ideas that you had at the end. So now over to Bob, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
As one always does, looking to see what I did with my presentation, which was right here, ready to go. And that is the wrong presentation.
Can you get a bit closer to the mic, Bob? You're kind of hard to hear.
I'm mumbling to myself because I'm trying to find what I did with my presentation.
Okay, that's better.
There we go. I think this will follow on nicely from what Christiane just had to say. She had the detailed insider's perspective. This is much more of an outsider's perspective on the lessons. So why might SPS be an example? Well, there's general lessons that I want to take from what works well, the specific trade concerns, EPing, things that have already been mentioned. But I also want to talk about a couple of special cases where we might well learn something specific from SPS. So you probably all are familiar with this pyramid of what goes on with SPS transparency and surveillance, but it's worth emphasizing that they have literally, over the life of the WTO, tens of thousands of notifications. And there's also lots of things going on at inquiry points. And only a small fraction of those even lead to a specific trade concern. All the reasons Christiane just mentioned of why those are a very useful opportunity. Worth pointing out that about even in who raises and responds to STCs between developed and developing countries, and the dispute settlement really is way at the bottom of the pyramid. There are more inquiry point comments than STCs, many more STCs than disputes. So this process is invaluable and really important. When I've talked about this before, some people say, well, yeah, SPS and TBT as well, they're a special case because you have to have ex ante notification of draft measures, whereas everywhere else is almost tombstone notification of things that have already been implemented. And while that's true, it's misleading because many STCs in SPS concern implemented measures, and it's still useful to talk about them, like why wasn't it more transparent or whatever. So this pyramid metaphor really should apply across the WTO. That's the first lesson. Every agreement has language like SPS Article 12.2, which permits something like STCs. That's the only legal authorization in the SPS agreement, that there should be these kinds of ad hoc consultations, and the whole edifice has grown from there. The pie chart on the right simply shows over a 5-year period where something like an STC took place across the organization. In 1 year that the Secretariat looked at, there were about 230 trade concerns in committees other than SPS and TBT. And they observed that in that period, the STCs, or the trade concerns, dwarfed the 28 dispute panels that began work in the same period. So what are the implications for WTO reform? Well, many bodies, in fact, do have something that looks like an STC, whether they're called questions or consultations or specific implementation matters. But the practice is uneven across committees. They don't all do it the same way. And of course, it is certainly related to the type and number of notifications. Few committees would have had as the tens of thousands of notifications that you see in SPS. It also matters, I think, whether the delegates in a particular committee are coming from capitals. We observe that every committee has minutes or summary records of its meetings, but some of those are much more detailed. You get a lot more information from reading the minutes or to understand what's happening or why a particular concern was raised. But also, there's quite wide variation in how those are recorded. Is it just in the minutes? Is there a document series for questions and answers? And perhaps most important, is there a searchable database? There is no consolidated information on STCs raised across the WTO. I would argue that firms would benefit, not just governments, if there were better databases, more easier ways to get information. Obviously, the gold standard is EPING, run for SPS and TBT in cooperation with the International Trade Center and UNDESA. One of the things, I've noted that at the ERA, one of the things that's great about it is that anybody can register and receive alerts about new notifications or new issues, and thousands of firms have done that. And this is important for firms because information is one of the most important trade costs. The point of the WTO is to try to reduce trade costs, and that matters especially at the extensive margin, meaning small firms in small countries trying to get a new product into a new market. And so getting this kind of centralized information on market conditions or changes in government policy is a really important thing to do. There's been some expansion of EPING into the Trade Concerns database, but so far it's a different way of visualizing the information in SPS and TBT with the addition of the Committee on Market Access. In contrast, there are information management systems. Agriculture is probably the most important, but it is a harder system to use. Doesn't have an alert system like EPING, not integrated with the others. And then there's something like the environmental database, which is great, has every environmental related notification that's submitted somewhere in the WTO, but the Environment Committee never discusses them, and the database has no trade concerns. So if a committee that receives an environment notification has a discussion or a question about that, it would be nice to find that in the EBB, but you don't. Another thing that has been emerging in SPS, especially in TBT, Christian will tell me if I've got it wrong, but it's basically a system to post an annotated agenda online well in advance of the meeting. So any document related to the meeting is online, officials and capitals are alerted to it. Because it's there online, it makes coordination in capitals easier in terms of providing instructions. It also allows a statement to be uploaded to the system, and that means the minutes appear much more quickly after a meeting. It means a question and answer can be uploaded in advance of the meeting. So it reduces the cycle, the period of time it takes to raise an STC and get an answer about the STC. I'm not sure if the CMA has one yet. I know that the Import Licensing Committee has been talking about it. I don't know if they have it yet, but it's really the sort of thing that everybody should have. So reforming STCs, this kind of process from SPS and generalizing it across the House means you get the potential for enhanced participation in meetings. You ought to get more substantive discussion in every committee, especially if capitals find it easier to engage and prepare instructions. And that, I think, is really important in committees where the delegates are really Geneva-based and not expert in the discussion. To the extent that you have better integrated databases, you can see issues arising across agreements and understand how they were discussed in other committees. And one of the benefits of this, aside from benefits to firms, ought to be avoiding conflict, avoiding dispute settlement. There have been proposals to do this. The EU led a proposal on procedural guidelines. It has been stalled for a long time, but I thought it was a great proposal, so I'll just highlight it again. It has very good suggestions on how to improve meeting arrangements. It does encourage the use of written questions and answers. For the reasons I've said, I think that's really important. It doesn't mention the e-agenda system, but it started life 2-3 years ago, so maybe if it was revised now, it would mention e-agenda. And it says there ought to be a searchable database of every document that pertains to a trade concern, which in fact is what you have in the Trade Concerns database, but it only deals with 3 committees. So it really should be expanded across the House. Christian mentioned the various ways that there are opportunities to talk to each other in the SPS committee. It's great. And more of those would give opportunities to hear from stakeholders, which includes regulators at home, but you can also, in a thematic session, you can include other international organizations, you include the private sector, civil society. There is a lot of that going on. There were over 100 years in the 3 years that we, or 100 in the 3 years that we looked at. There's all kinds of names that they are called, and you heard that from Christian as well. Some committees held none, including some where you might think they would particularly benefit. The SPS committee held more than anybody else in that period. So it's another reason why it's exemplary. This is just an example of one of the most recent ones. Not necessarily a barn burner for the general trade policy community, but exactly the kind of thing that the people involved in the domain need to talk about. Christian also mentioned the way that the committee has periodic self-reflection on what it does. This is the cover page from the 5th quadrennial review. It began with a mandate from ministers in 2001. You get proposals for improvements, you get a record of actions and decisions. It's just a periodic stock taking and looking forward, which is, I think, valuable and something every committee ought to be doing. And then the engagement with capitals for the new vision, which she also talked about, quite remarkable. I don't think there was any other committee that got anywhere near to doing something like that at MC12. Not a bad thing for other committees to do, to have a conversation about what their purpose is and what they should be doing going forward, and get that blessed by ministers at MC13. That could be terrific. So that's those are the things that we ought to learn from, in general, from what the SPS committee has been up to. I want to draw some specific lessons for the new Fisheries Committee. Article 9 of the agreement has language that's very similar, that's permissive of an STC process. But the new committee, once it gets going, really needs to develop that process. It's an area where learning from each other and elaborating the system of informal or soft law that Christian was talking about is going to be really important. And of course, they need a database of every question and answer that was raised in the committee. Capital-based participation is going to be crucial. That's one of the points of the new agreement. So having an e-agenda system for this committee would be excellent. And if you have that, you're going to have the opportunity for experts to seek clarifications, to raise concerns. There is a requirement in the agreement for periodic review. As we've argued with SPS, that's really essential. It's also good that the agreement says there should be close contact with the FAO and regional fisheries management organizations. That's great. But thematic sessions would also be really useful because they're certainly not the end of history with this agreement. And so engaging the broad fisheries community on what the context is for fisheries subsidies, what issues are still out there, what more needs to be done, that will be really important. And finally, national security. I know this is an issue that Bernard has been thinking about. When we think about national SPS, at one level, all it is an amplification of GATT Article 20. In that article, there's an exception for measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. And the whole SPS agreement and the whole evolution of the SPS committee has been an effort to bring that to life, to have discussions, to figure out how it works, to use the committee to avoid conflict in that domain. Article 21, the security article, is also about exceptions, but there's no committee, and there's very limited jurisprudence. In a couple of recent presentations, Petros Mavroidis has said that litigation using Article 21 is problematic. STCs could be a much better route for discussion of the issues that are now arising across the House on national security. And there are a lot of those STCs already. 25 on cybersecurity and in market access and TBT committees. There's been some in the Council for Trade and Services. There may be some in other places. When you look at the Trade Concerns database, you find that many notifications on quantitative restrictions cite Article 21 as a justification for the measure. Doesn't seem like any of the 67 trade concerns in the CMA database reference Article 21. So I don't know if those notifications have caused any problems. So we're not going to get a committee on national security. We know who comes from capitals for SPS, but who would come for a security committee? It's diffuse and goes all over the place. So you won't have a dedicated body, but if there was an e-agenda system across the House that flagged security issues as they come up in committees, at STCs, whatever, that would facilitate the engagement of capital-based experts, which I think would make a big difference to having discussions about these issues before they rise into more conflict. And of course, thematic sessions could be quite helpful on security issues. And indeed, TBT is having such a thematic session planned for next June. The Ukraine war, turns out, is referenced a lot across the WTO. There have been, we know there have been a lot of sanctions imposed by members in various areas of trade policy. And we also know that there have been discussions about these sanctions, again, across the House in a number of committees. It would be great if there was a database where all of those things came together and one could see what the discussion was about sanctions imposed on Russia because of the Ukraine war. So let me close with a final observation about why SPS works, and that's the deep engagement with a community of regulators and capitals. Those guys know they need to work with their counterparts. They go to the SPS committee, they engage with it. That's not so easy to replicate in other domains. I think it's worth trying, but one has to be realistic about what the obstacles would be. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Bob. So clearly going beyond SPS and thinking about what are the lessons that can and should be learned from the experience in the SPS committee. Okay, so the floor is open. We have 27 people. So I guess the best thing to do is just raise your hand if you want the floor. I guess we're a bit too many to just start talking. So let me know who wants to engage on this. Alan is first. So we're sticking with the wolf pattern here.
It's a wolf pack kind of day, huh?
Yeah, this is a question for both wolves, maybe even Bernard as an adoptee as a wolf for the moment. This session has been extraordinarily useful. However, it comes a few days late for me because I had to give a talk on Tuesday to the semiconductor industries of 6 jurisdictions and their governments and authorities. So the 2 Chinas, as well as EU, Korea, Japan, and the US. And the topic was, to a large extent, what to do about subsidies. And transparency was a major issue for them. And another one of the speakers was Clarice Morgan, the director for the Rules Division at the WTO. And one of the things that I mentioned and others mentioned is that TBT, I should have said SPS as well, the experience has been very good. Subsidies, terrible. I mean, everyone says that, including the chair of the subsidies committee. And I listed a few reasons why that was the case, but I would be very interested in the speakers saying, okay, Bob Wolf just took the Article 21 as an example of great sensitivity for countries, but no committee. Well, there is a subsidies committee, and it's also a sensitive area. Why doesn't it work in terms of transparency? If you were doing a 2-column print of why SPS works and why subsidies committee notifications don't work, what would be some of the items you would list?
Great question. So who wants to take that? Bob? Christian?
And that's a great question. And I have thought about it, but it's not fresh in my mind. So excuse me if I flounder a little bit in trying to think about it. There isn't a great STC process in subsidies. It's probably weaker there than anywhere else. There is a notification requirement that puts unreasonable expectations on whoever would notify in capital in terms of what you think the injury to the subsidy might be. And you have a committee that is composed of Geneva delegates for the most part. Some of them might have come from the finance ministry at home, but they're not necessarily real subsidies experts. And so my guess is that two of the things I've been proposing as general lessons from SPS would make a huge difference. One is an e-agenda system, so that the detailed questions and answers about particular subsidies could be online ahead of a meeting, and that might make it easier to engender coordination in capitals to get the answer, to get the discussion. And the other might be to actually have some thematic sessions on what the particular issues where people are having a problem. I see Victor has just posted something in the chat. I would be happy to see what he's posted, because Victor, before he went straight by joining the Secretariat, as I recall, was the chair of the Subsidies Committee. So maybe he has a better answer than I do. I'll stop for a moment.
So we'll come back to Victor. Christian, you want to come in on this?
Not much to add. Maybe to add, well, one thing to add actually, in terms of the e-agenda, when we introduced that, I think initially it was an idea actually that Eric Wikström, my counterpart on the TBT side, had, because to help us manage the inflowing STCs in advance of committee meetings, because usually it's quite chaotic. We were getting all these emails and trying to reflect them accurately on the agenda. So initially it was only designed to make our life easier. But what it has now become is this one-stop shop for all the information about a committee meeting. And we try to reflect that also in the annotated draft agenda that we put out, which basically, at least in the SPS area, is the same as the information that is reflected in e-agenda. In SPS, we include all agenda items, and TBT, it's concentrated on STCs. And I think in addition to that, though, I think, and also very important, is that instead of making all this information available the traditional 10 days before a meeting, that is the norm across WTO committee meetings, we had a request around the same time to close the agenda 3 weeks before a meeting. So now, for example, for the upcoming meeting in early November, we are circulating the annotated draft agenda today, and that provides 3 weeks for the homework that members have to do instead of the just over 1 week that they used to have. And I think that also helps. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, so let me just add a little bit on Alan's question. So I've also thought and written about this. So I have a paper with Doug Nelson that actually advocates that you really need to start with deliberation. Right, and I think part of the focus in subsidies, of course, is, what is required, the fear of throwing stones when everybody lives in glass houses. And I think what Christian said is that if you can create an environment where you can actually have a discussion about, what are we doing? Why are we doing? Is it having any effects? What do we learn from experience? Forget about the law. And I think part of the problem here is to take potential actionability off the table. But you need to create an environment where you can have that type of a discussion. And it seems to me one of the unique features about the SPS context is you have the codex, you have the FAO, you have this, what the political scientists call an epistemic community that actually works on this and cares about it. And that's a bit missing in the subsidies area. Right now, the IMF closed its office in Geneva ages ago, right? And if you think about what international organization is best placed to actually engage on providing information on subsidies and actually also doing some analysis on subsidies, it would be the IMF. So I think part of the answer, I would argue, has to be to try and bring in some of the players who have a vested interest and expertise in that area, and then go to thematic session routes and learn by doing, especially now that there is no appellate body, so you can't get taken to court anyway. So, that makes it maybe a little bit easier to get it going. Okay, I've got Sherry, then Gabrielle, and then Lou. Sherry. Oh, I'm sorry, and we'll come back to Victor, because I think Victor also indicated he's quite happy to elaborate on his comment.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Thank you so much to the two presenters. Really interesting discussion, and one that we don't take up very often. And so it's really instructive. I've always found that working of the TBT and the SPS committees to be incredibly useful and instructive, and also probably the best working bodies in the WTO, many people have said. But I just kind of wanted to bring up some points that follow up on what we just heard from Alan, and that is in the services area, which is the one I know best, and Hamid's on the call, which I really appreciate, so maybe he will also follow in this, but it's just really difficult to reproduce this kind of model because there are so many different service sectors. They cover such a wide, diverse range of activity. Perhaps it's easier to elicit the desire to make notifications in SPS and TBT because you have a single set of government officials who are responsible for collecting and providing this information, and a single body. I know in the US it's a NIST, and so in services you don't have that. You have maybe 10, 11 different sectors. You have, of course, a focal point within government, but then it's very, very hard. There have been so few notifications on measures that new regulations in the services area, so few. Hamid can comment on this further. And, how to elicit this enthusiasm. One of the biggest reasons for success is because there is so much information made available. Because the information is there, then you can discuss it. If the information is not there, it's really hard to discuss it. So I guess my question is how to, similar to Alan's, to reproduce this enthusiasm across different areas of the WTO so that we can have a similar type of success story. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sherry. Gabrielle?
Hi, I think I wrote what I wanted to say, and it's not very wise or new, except that SPS, remember Gretchen was even chairing the committee during the round, which is again evidence that it's less maybe sensitive, not less important, but more technical. And we usually say SPS is scientist, although Christiane always says she's not a scientist. It's more expert type comments, where subsidy is much, much more closer to industrial policy. And then you go into almost, the role of government type debates in the market, economic thinking. I don't think you will ever be able to reproduce the SPS as broadly as you would like, because it deals with a different animal. Thanks.
I disagree. If there's anything that's technical, it's a subsidy. So you just
maybe
need to
the way
drill down.
it is run, but the capacity to pay and all that.
No, I think you should be focusing on the instruments, the effect. So I think there is a real, if you look at what the IMF does on every time they go on mission and have discussions with the Minister of Finance, it's a very technical discussion. Yes, there's politics, but there's also politics in product standards in SPS. Anyway, let me, so we've had two interventions. Let me take one more. Victor, why don't you come in and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bernard, and thanks, Alan, for the thought-provoking question. This is an area, of course, that those involved in subsidies. And I must say, Bob Wolf reminded the time that I was the chair of the subsidies committee. I must say that I found it particularly challenging to be the secretary of the subsidies committee when I joined the secretariat in 2002. It was much more difficult to be the secretary of the subsidies committee than to chair it. And I see Christian smiling. You know, the chairs sometimes have an easier life than the secretaries of the committees. But yeah, I mean, we struggled with the issue of notifications. And mind you, this is I was the secretary of the committee at the time that China joined. It was very difficult to convince China to present a subsidies notification. There were all sorts of reasons for this. Subsidies involve, of course, sensitive areas of government. I do think that the fact that only actionable subsidies are to be notified, and it's almost like a self-declaration. You are accusing yourself of maintaining specific actionable subsidies, although the agreement says that the notification has no legal effect. That might discourage people. Even the counter notification provision in the subsidies agreement, which is not something that you find in other agreements, has not really been used extensively, except the US on China and on India. And I mean, surely there are sensitivities in SPS, as Christian recalls us, deals with food. However, I do think that subsidies has a specific sensitivity in terms of people saying, you know, why am I going to accuse myself of maintaining actionable subsidies? I don't present my notification, you don't present yours, and you get into a downward spiral of nobody notifying. That is something that, you know, people thought that during the GATT times, there were no notifications in the subsidies committee, in the GATT subsidies committee, because there was no definition of subsidy. Well, we do have a definition of subsidy in the WTO, and still the notification record is really appalling. And I guess it has to do with politics, and it has to do with dispute settlement. Maybe wrong. And other things like, you know, notifications of subsidies are incredibly complex to compile, involving different agencies, different levels of government, and etc. Just a few hints. There might be other reasons as well. Thanks, Bernard.
Thanks, Victor. It seems to me the solution is not to look at this through the lens of notifications, but to really look at it to step back and say, okay, let's actually potentially, you know, let's look at what's in the global trade alert. What are we seeing there? You know, why are we seeing what we're seeing, and so forth, and, you know, step away from the I accuse myself kind of mindset. Let's go back to the panel, and then I've got Lou and Hamid. So, Bob.
Well, quickly, Sherry made a good point at the end that there's so many different kinds of services. One of the pities of the Agreement on Trade and Basic Telecommunication Services is that no committee or working group or subcommittee was created to carry on. So you had this group of experts who came together to draft the agreement, and then they dissipated. So I don't know if there's scope to have more such bodies under the Council for Trade and Services, but it is a way to engage groups of experts in capitals. Are subsidies political? Well, yeah, but as already been said, so is SPS, and most everything else has a political dimension. One of the reasons that the Uruguay round made progress on agriculture was because finance ministers at OECD ministerials said, deal with this, get working on it. And that impetus helped. The fisheries subsidies has had a degree of political impetus, which has helped. But if you leave it to the people in the SCM committee for that political impetus, you'll never get it. So to an extent, that's right why Bernard is saying you need to have discussions outside the formal structures where you can do the analysis and talk about the analysis on where there are cross-border spillovers of subsidies issues, and there are. One example of where that could have happened, and I don't think has, is the OECD did 2 landmark studies on the what am I talking about? The microchip supply chain and the aluminum supply chain, and they were looking at where the subsidies were right across those industries. In the STM committee, there was some resentment that those things had even been done, but there was never an attempt to have something like a thematic session with OECD, with IMF, with people from the industries, and WTO members talking about what the implications of that work would be. And I think that something like that would really be useful. And there's probably a whole bunch of issues where you want to have that sort of discussion. And yes, I agree with Victor on why notifications are appalling, and with some of the problems. They are complex, really hard to know when you are doing something that might hurt a trading partner. And of course, you also have a levels of government problem. It's astonishing how seldom the United States notifies that there are any subsidies at the state level in that country, although, as we all know, that's where a lot of the subsidies are.
Indeed. Christian?
Yes, on the multitude of actors, I think that has probably something to do with it. I mean, in the SPS area, we do also get different national actors involved. I think, for example, just as an example, on the US side, you do have the Food and Drug Administration, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food Safety Inspection Service, USTR. I mean, there usually in any SPS committee meeting, at least 5, if not more, government agencies just from the US that are represented and that are having coordinating meetings and so on before every meeting. So, but probably still fewer than in services, for sure. One of the things the committee has done from early on is to have regular workshops on transparency and notifications, and also on national level coordination, and very much emphasizing that this is absolutely necessary for just the ability to implement the agreement. I do also think that the incentives to notify are quite different in SPS and TBT, where potentially you can avoid future trade problems. I remember Gretchen telling me that during the negotiations, at least one member had said, we don't want notifications to be publicly available because then our domestic stakeholders will find out. But I think this might be even more applicable in the services area, where there are a lot of concerns about who will find out what and what the vested interests are. And then maybe to return to notifications just for 1 minute, in the SPS agreement, the obligation is also only to notify those regulations that go beyond international standards or that are not based on an international standard. But the committee has sort of done away with that and has said, we recommend that you notify all your regulations, whether or not they're based on an international standard, because it's still useful information for your trading partners to have. So I think that's interesting because it changes the focus of the notifications. It's not just those that are potentially problematic because they deviate from an international standard, but it's much broader in terms of providing a heads up of all regulatory changes. So I don't know if something could be learned from that for other areas.
Thanks. Okay, Lou.
Yeah, thanks. When Victor was talking about trying to persuade China, who has had hesitation to notify subsidies, I was the one who he has been talking to actually at that moment. No, my comment and question would be...
You don't have to accuse yourself, Lou. I remember.
My comment and the question is very much on what Bob has done with his PPT on this kind of different measures under the name of security, and about whether you have SPS as committee, which could go under the Article 20 exception, but no other committees for other kind of national security exceptions. My sense here is that because recently in some FMG sessions we have talked about this kind of proliferation of national security or the security, economic security trade measures, and then someone called it securitization of trade measures, which is quite problematic. For me, is that definitely I see there's a need to do a kind of more focused discussion somewhere in the WTO or outside of the WTO on this, because this is heavily impacting the whole system. But the other thing is that let's take SPS committee, for example. You do need trade experts, but also experts from other ministry or departments. But those are none of them can have any say on security issues. So probably you need to get someone more political from foreign affairs and others. And then those people would not want to come to the WTO to explain about anything behind this. So they would simply deny it, or they would simply find something else to describe what they have done. So my question to you, and also including Bernard, would be that the same logic, that would it be better to do a kind of outside WTO or a kind of informal outside of the strict box of the WTO to discuss this, and so that you could invite some other not trade officials, some other officials in charge of security, and then to explain, to discuss, or some other existing mechanism in the WTO, like the monitoring mechanism. They do all kinds of these things. Could they also have a specific segment on security-related measures? So that would provide a good focal point of information. Or the trade policy review mechanism, which has been expanding its mandate in the past years into sustainability and other things. They could also probably gradually, at least for some key players, include this into their review process. So thank you.
Thanks, Lou. So lots of questions there. So let's take two more. Hamid.
Thank you, Bernard, and good afternoon, everyone. Excellent, fascinating points made, absolutely, and I agree with almost all of them. I think the difference that I see, let me start with services, as Sherry pointed out. It's a very different situation, and perhaps we have the tools for addressing specific trade concerns in services, and Article 3, an invitation to any member to notify to the Services Council any measure taken by another member, even a measure contemplated by another member. And we've had some use of that, as Bob has shown in his presentation, but it is not and never been used even closely as frequently as it should be and as frequently as it is needed. Because of multiple reasons. Some of them are political, because of sensitivity, obviously, but also the point raised by Bernard, or referred to, about inability is a deterrent. And here I look at the SPS. Of course, I'm not an SPS expert, but I can see that SPS and TBT are a bit distinct in a very important way, in my view. And that is, those are instruments actually that are based on internationally agreed standards, which we don't have to the same extent elsewhere. They lend themselves to scientific evidence in analyzing the consequences and rationale behind measures taken. And they involve more homogeneous communities of experts. Now, of course, there are political concerns from time to time, absolutely. But they are quite different in terms of the content, the nature of the content, and also the disciplines that apply to those measures in terms of internationally agreed standards. Now, how do we address the main concern, institutional concern, of addressing specific trade concerns in WTO committees and councils in areas where it is difficult to promote. That, I think, is going to be a challenge that we will have to address in the context of WTO reform. But unfortunately, I suspect it will have to start with encouraging members to, through realizing that it is in their interest to revitalize those functions. Now, all the tools that Bob referred to are excellent. The e-agenda, uploading questions and answers prior to the practices, I think, of the SPS agreement are exemplary, but we need to think about how could they be applied in areas where they're not as easily applicable as in SPS. These are just some thoughts, but thank you so much for the excellent points made.
Thanks, Hamid. Okay, let's have one more speaker, Nakatomi-san, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, I have one question. Well, there are many commonalities between TBT and SPS, but this time I think it's very encouraging that SPS has a special declaration, but apparently there's none for TBT. Would there be any implication to the implementation of TBT agreement if SPS declaration will be carried out? About the situation in SPS and TBT, I understand now that there's close communication among the secretariat and there's good coordination, but is there something different? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that. So back to the panel. Christian, you want to kick off?
Sure, and I apologize. I'm not sure I caught the question at the end. Were you asking about what is different between SPS and TBT? So why do we have a declaration in one and not the other? Or is it a different question?
Yes. And so I don't know the history of the declaration, but if I think there's something like this in SPS, I think ideally, I think TBT has a similar, declaration, but that's not the case. I would like to know the background, and I'd like to know how I think the implication of the deliberation in SPS will affect TBT. That's my question. Yeah.
I think the reason that there's not a sort of a systematic reason why the SPS, where there's an SPS declaration, not a TBT declaration. The SPS declaration actually started as the initiative of a few delegates who just thought it would be great to get some more attention, some recognition from ministers, and sort of some impetus or some reinvigoration of the discussions in the committee with attention from ministers. And it actually started back before Buenos Aires, when initially the US, together with some others, made a proposal on a ministerial declaration on pesticides. And some of the questions that were asked them, like, why do we need this ministerial declaration? Why is this not something that the SPS committee can just decide to do on its own, and so on? I think there was a learning process, and at some point the US delegate who at that part put that forward said, okay, we're going to take a different approach for the next ministerial conference, put forward something much broader, frame it in a different way, and that ended up working, and of course gathering a lot of support. I mean, they did a lot of work behind the scenes to bring others on board. So I think that was key, and I don't think it was just different people involved. I'm not sure that there's a particular reason why they didn't do it on the TBT side.
Yep.
And even when the SPS committee discussed this declaration that ended up going through, one of the most frequently asked questions was, why? You know, the SPS committee is working fine. It can do whatever it wants pretty much. If it wants to work on these topics, it can just go ahead and do so. So I think on the TBT side, maybe the answer is that the TBT committee is able to do the work that it wants to do without any instructions from ministers. Of course, that always gives sort of an additional pressure to deliver and more attention and some extra motivation, but it's probably just not strictly necessary. So I'm not sure that there will necessarily be implications from the fact that the SPS committee has this work program, and the TBT committee has its own work program, but not one that it has received from ministers. We'll see how it pans out. I have to say that some of the additional attention we've had on the SPS declaration work program has not only been helpful. You know, the small groups that members envisage to have these informal discussions among themselves on the topics of the declaration. At the first meeting, more than 100 people showed up just because there was so much interest, so much attention on them. And I'm sure that will change over time, but we'll still have to see whether that will turn out to have been an advantage or not, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the explanation. Yeah, now I understand the situation. Thank you.
On that last point, I hope I don't betray a confidence when I say that I had a conversation with Eric Wickstrom maybe 18 months ago, where he was chagrined that SPS had this declaration coming and delegates didn't want to do it in TBT. There was no impetus from delegates. So, you know, outsiders sometimes laugh when WTO people say it's a member-driven organization, but it is. And SPS delegates wanted it, TBT delegates did not. Having said that, one of the things that different project that Bernard and I have been working on can be summarized as capitals and Geneva are not necessarily on the same planet. And the SPS committee is better than most at closing that gap. And maybe part of what has to happen across the House is thinking about how to better engage capitals in the work of the WTO.
Yeah.
That's certainly what the SPS declaration does. One of the things that you get when you start talking about improved notifications, for example, or improved committee procedures is from developing countries who are saying it's too complicated, it's too much work. Well, it may be too complicated for very small Geneva delegations who've got all sorts of things to do, not necessarily too complicated for people in capitals if they could be engaged with it. So that's why e-agenda, for example, and other ways to use new technologies to let somebody at their desk in the capital engage with WTO might actually make it easier to do new things because members would be more directly engaged. And that's really my answer in part to Hamid's observation. How do you do this? Well, you use the new technologies to get people in capitals better engaged. Lou asks two questions. The most senior people who are making a lot of security decisions aren't going to come to Geneva. That's true. Having some kinds of places related to the WTO or even thematic sessions under the General Council might get some of those people to come. But a lot of the stuff that has a national security justification is not high politics. It is the kinds of technical things that go on in WTO all the time. And that's why things like e-agenda might be a way to engage the security people who don't normally think about WTO, but here's one specific thing that they should think about. That could be a way to engage them. Could you use the monitoring reports better? Yes, for all sorts of things, with a even stronger mandate to the Secretariat and more resources in the TPR division. But even there, if you say, well, we could use it to do a better job on subsidies. There's a lot of information. The monitoring calls it general economic support. You could do a much better job using the reports on general economic support, except there's one huge, well, two huge big problems. The United States and China don't respond to the Secretariat request for information on their general economic support, which makes that part of the reports kind of useless. And that could also, if you start asking using the DG's questionnaire for the monitoring reports to ask questions about security related things, there too you may discover that countries simply don't respond.
Thanks. Okay, so Stuart.
Thanks very much, Bernard. And let me just say how great it is to see Nakatomi-san on the call. I think it's his first involvement with the group, and he's a very old friend. Very nice indeed to see him. But basically, I just wanted to make a very short comment, essentially to reinforce Bob's comment about the importance of trying to involve capital-based officials in Geneva committees and deliberations. Of course, there are no rules in this area, and members are completely free to designate whomever they wish to represent them at meetings. You obviously can't force them to send capital-based officials, but they can be encouraged to come. And my perspective on that is that if the WTO, or indeed any forum, is seen as a place where regulators and experts can come and add value for each other, they will come. And there's lots of examples of that, not only SPS, but also, I would say in the services area. I think back to the negotiations on basic telecoms, which I had a tangential involvement in myself. And that was basically done by capital-based people. The trade people didn't understand it. And the Geneva people certainly didn't understand it. But they, for some reason, it may have been to do with the state of the technology at the time and the way the regulatory environment was changing. The telecoms people piled in and they loved it. They had a great negotiation. So, and I think there are other examples, although maybe, not so related to negotiations and hard commitments. But for example, I think going back before COVID, the UNCTAD e-commerce week became quite a forum for all sorts of experts and stakeholders to come to Geneva and talk about that sort of stuff. So I think if we can somehow work on that, encourage people to come and make Geneva a place where non-trade people feel they can come and add value and learn from each other, then I think that's the way to go. Thanks very much for a very interesting discussion to everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. One problem is it's an expensive place to go and spend time. Jonathan.
Let me unmute, sorry. So thanks to both for a very enlightening discussion. A few observations that they each may wish to comment on. Number one is the fact that I think there's been tallies over recent years going into MC12 and before as to how far behind countries are on various notifications in various committees. The more complex and comprehensive you seek to be on the notification, the more difficult it is for capitals to accumulate that information, all the more so for developing countries with capacity constraints. So we're losing a significant responsiveness by not being able to be timely in peer review and discussion and airing. Second, to recall that TBT and SPS, while often seen in parallel as mirror images, are quite distinct. Going back to the origins of the SPS agreement, in fact, it's an elaboration of Article 20. It is an exception and a code that says, here's what otherwise might be impermissible, but is permissible in the name of health, safety, and so on. So to that extent, it's a very finite field. It's also finite to the extent that 99%, not to assign a specific number, of the SPS measures find their grounding in terms of international benchmarks in Codex, in the OIE, and in the International Plant Protection Organization. Whereas TBT, as others have noted, including in the chat, cover a huge range of standards with origins in various organizations, forums, private sector, and so on. That makes notification much more difficult. Third observation on subsidies is to recall the experience of the Global Forum on Excess Steel Subsidies. Here was an effort, supposedly with mutual agreement as to the objective, which was calibrated, agreed reduction in steel subsidies, sort of a disarmament negotiation that would move in tandem so that nobody's relative market access position would be prejudiced. The data was accumulated. Countries, by buying into the process, volunteered to bring forward their subsidies information. Well, there were two difficulties that I think are indicative of any effort to get a subsidies notification regime in a meaningful way. One, Bob highlighted, and that is, while the United States did a decent job, China found itself unable to gather, let alone share, subnational, provincial, and municipal subsidies to the table, and that basically brought down the process. Secondly, as all of you know better than me, the range of tools available that would otherwise constitute a subsidy range from proaction to abstention, from tax to finance to corporate form, and so on. What are the parameters for any kind of notification, given the huge range of tools available to industry ministries, finance ministries, and so on, that in the end result, the professional economists would say, yeah, the impact is trade distorting and is a subsidy in that regard. I think there's a huge amount of groundwork to be laid in terms of what a fair subsidies notification regime might constitute. And again, how burdensome, because if it's asking for too much, you're going to wait 5 years for the United States to accumulate the information, even if it's well-intentioned. So some comments for provoking some responses from the panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. To me, your last point essentially just re-emphasizes the importance of moving away from notification, because you really need to be looking at effects, and clearly economists have developed tools to do that, and I think we should start with that. And you can only really do that through a process of deliberation based on analysis. And that's something we haven't really discussed a lot yet this afternoon, but the fact that the Secretariat is not permitted to do analysis is actually a big problem, because ultimately you need to rank order. Your example of the subsidy story, obviously there's very many different ways to intervene, and you need to look at ultimately how far away are you from market benchmark, independent of whatever specific instrument you're using. But that requires analysis. Otherwise, you're just basically lost. Let's go back to our panelists. Who wants to start? Nobody? Bob?
I think the main thing is to that's on the table is the 4 points Bernard made, or that Jonathan made. There is a distinction between Jonathan and Bernard. I do know that. I think you've answered his fourth point. Yes, there are tallies of how far behind countries are on their notifications. There has been an interesting process of trying to generate a proposal for improving notifications. The Americans led it and made a huge mistake at the outset in thinking that one result could be punishment for countries that don't notify. That is gone from the proposal. It's now a fairly sensible proposal. One of the key parts of what's on the table is telling every committee to rethink what kind of information it's actually asking for in a notification and how that notification should be prepared. It's really quite a useful proposal. The usual suspects, that is India, blocked it at the July General Council, which was not a good augury for WTO reform, but it's the sort of thing that has to happen. his second point about SPS in particular being based on the Three Sisters, on kind of recognized standards, I think that's right, and there's no way to get that for subsidies or much else. The experience of the Global Forum was an interesting one. Bernard and I actually talked to the OECD Secretariat about that experience, and it, in the end, it suffered from a couple of problems, one of which was that the OECD could only be a secretariat. So they could only use information provided by members. They had no capacity to go out and look for other information, and they couldn't do any assessment. So you get reports, and then you get reports that only dealt with excess capacity, which is not at all the same as the economic effects of all steel-related policy, let alone the trade impact of steel-related policy. And then the complete information wasn't public. So the greater transparency that the forum might have achieved was only internal to participating governments. And because the way the whole thing was framed, China perceived, probably rightly, that the whole thing was a tool to pressure and attack China, so they dropped out. And yet, it is the sort of thing where I think if it was more open, and as Bernard says, if you could actually do some analysis based on economic principles of what is going on with subsidies, you might get to the point of having greater consensual understanding among participating governments and the broader trade policy community of what the actual cross-border externalities are that might be worth some kind of discipline. And you're not going to get that with a legal document that tries to specify ex ante what it is that has to be notified and why those things are a problem.
Thanks, Bob. Christian? There's also a question by Alan in the chat, which asks you something specific.
I was just going to pick up on that.
Why don't you also take that up?
Yeah, I was just going to start with that, actually, Alan's question, whether there's more of a scope for the Secretariat to be active with respect to SPS compared to other WTO committees. And I think the answer is yes. And I think it's partly related to the history of the SPS committee. I forgot who mentioned it, was Gabrielle, I think, that my predecessor, Gretchen, actually chaired the negotiating body that came up with the SPS agreement. So from the beginning, the Secretariat was very active. And I think one of the reasons why that continues to be accepted and even maybe considered normal is that many of the SPS committee's delegates are capital-based, so they don't really know what is normal in other WTO committees. I mean, some SPS delegates are local delegates, and they, of course, know, but many of them just don't know, and they think it's normal because that's what they know. I think why the local the delegates are more able to accept it, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe it's partly because of the technical nature of the work. Maybe it is because the SPS committee is seen maybe as less political in the sense that it is more about resolving particular problems than about making more systemic or cross or points that would be relevant across committees and thereby setting precedents. It's quite specific to resolving particular problems, and the experts are there to do that. And if something that the Secretariat does seems to help, then they're okay with it. Returning back to, I think the involvement of capital-based experts does play a big role, not just with the acceptability of actions by the Secretariat, but in general. And I was thinking recently about that having the virtual or now hybrid meetings has been, I think, both an opportunity, but it can also be a problem potentially, because it has allowed, I mean, the United States can afford to send 10 representatives from 5 different agencies to come to Geneva for an SPS committee meeting if they think it's that important. But many other countries, of course, cannot do that. And for them now, they have the possibility of having not just the local delegate, but the capital-based officials present in the meeting. And it has given also the local delegates, I think, a way to push for more involvement from capital. I remember one delegate telling me, okay, now I'm not going to answer the specific trade concerns that I don't understand why we're having those policies. I'm going to make the veterinary services give those responses, you know. And so I think it has broadened the involvement. But at the same time, we do see a lot of delegates who are there but not active. They're just connected to the meeting, but they're not actually saying something. And yeah, wondering what to do about that, or whether that is a problem or whether that is okay. And then I think after a couple of years of virtual meetings, we have also noticed that it starts to erode the relationships in the committee. And I think the fact that people are able to have a coffee together, I mean, all the corridor talk, the bilaterals that happen here in Geneva, of course, that does not happen in the same way when we have virtual meetings. So the participation is much broader, but it is also much more shallow in a way. And I think building these in-person relationships, being able to exchange is very important. And we're currently thinking about what to do to make people come back. I mean, it's happening to a certain extent, but I think one of the things is that it needs to be worth it to come. You know, if it's just to come and sit in a meeting room and listen to statement after statement after statement that's being read out, that you can probably do more comfortably from your own sofa or your own office. So there has to be something else that makes it interesting, and whether that is the bilateral meetings that are sort of beyond the Secretariat's control, whether that is engagement with experts who have come for a thematic session, whether that is a side event that you would like to attend, and also maybe just the breadth and the combination of all these different ways to engage in 1 week here in Geneva, that you say, okay, we're gonna come. And then just practically, I mean, we've for years now tried to set the thematic agenda for the SPS committee up to a year in advance. So we're going to try to agree on the thematic sessions for 2023 at the upcoming meeting in November, so that capitals can plan, you know, who's going to come to which committee, how are we going to organize the travel? Can we pay for an expert to go, and so on? So that helps, that these very practical things, setting the committee dates a year in advance so that people can plan, and making all the information available in a just really accessible way. I think that those are all just practical points that contribute.
Great, thanks for that. We are over time now, so I think we've reached the end of our session. So I think this was an extremely interesting, rich discussion. I think one thing I wanted to mention with respect to Lou's comments or question really on the security front. So this is something I'm working on with Petros Mavroidis and Doug Nelson. And essentially one of the things that we emphasize in that paper is clearly this is super political, but like Bob mentioned, a lot of this is also super technical. And there's really huge scope, I think, to elucidate and to make more, to get a better sense of what these technical issues actually are. Right? I think one of the big advantages of this deliberation thematic session type of an approach to security issues is it forces the people who make the case and who argue that this is actually a big deal. Okay, explain it to me. Why? You know, so what actually is going on here? And then there's a lot of stuff I think that goes on in this world where essentially it's, you know, take me on faith. Trust me, I'm the expert, but I'm not going to explain this to you because after all, it's security. And I think a lot of that can be bogus, right? Certainly not all of it, but I think there is real scope. And if it really is confidential, you need to create mechanisms where you can have that discussion among experts. And it's not, you know, you don't find it in the Financial Times the next day. But having that discussion on the technical issues, I think, is extremely important, including with potential adversaries, because otherwise I see great scope for capture. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, I would argue, if you put on your public choice political economy hat, there is a lot of rent-seeking going on, hiding behind this notion of national security. Now, that might not be politically very correct to say. It's certainly not something that people would like to hear. But I think it's a fact. And, you know, we've been around this bush, you know, many, many times before. And, you know, so that's kind of natural. So I think that's where these the institution of this deliberation type of an approach, which may or may not be a specific trade concern type of approach, I think could actually be very valuable. And like many have said on this call, the institutional infrastructure for that is kind of missing, but the concepts and the experience that we get from the SPS setting is there, and we can certainly build on that. So let me end with that. Thank everybody for dialing in, and hope to see you all soon on another call, if not in person.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.